The Wellesley family arrived in the quiet, untouched hills of rural England, the carriages rolling slowly through the dense, untamed woods toward their sprawling estate. Lord Richard Wellesley, a man of stately appearance and calm authority, stepped out first, his posture impeccable, his face set in a mask of serene control. His wife Eleanor followed, her eyes always just a little too sharp, a little too aware, as if the air itself held secrets she'd learned to read. The children, Eliza, Thomas, and young Mary, stepped from the carriage like shadows, their faces hidden under the weight of their dark hoods. They were silent, unnaturally so, as if their mere presence could not disturb the stillness of the land around them. This, of course, was exactly how Lord Wellesley liked it. His family was his world, and they were to remain a secret, isolated from the prying eyes of society. No visitors would be allowed, no neighbors to meddle in the affairs of the Wellesleys. It was to be a life of quiet distinction, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond their gates. The estate, built from ancient stone and surrounded by miles of dark forest, had been in the Wellesley family for generations. It stood as a testament to their power, their legacy, strong, enduring, unwavering. The sprawling grounds, the ivy-clad walls, the deep-set windows all spoke of wealth and dignity, but there was something else beneath the surface. There always was with the Wellesleys. Lord Richard made sure of it. His voice, always steady, carried a subtle weight when he spoke of their new life, their homecoming. He would speak of their homeschooling regimen for the children, how important it was for them to be shielded from the distractions of the outside world, how their education would be unlike anything offered in ordinary schools. He was a man of purpose, one who believed the world could be molded by sheer will. It was a quiet pride that reflected in his every word, his every action. And yet, a deeper sense of unease began to grow in the corners of the estate. It was in the way the children barely spoke, their voices thin and tentative when they did. They seemed less like children and more like empty vessels, their eyes hollow as if something had already been taken from them. The servants, too, were uneasy, never quite able to place why the air in the manor felt so thick, so dense with unsaid things. There were murmurs, faint ones, that the Wellesleys were not like other families, that their lives were designed to keep secrets and that those secrets ran deep. The children never played outside. No laughing or shouting echoed across the grounds. They stayed within the high walls of the house, their world smaller than any child's should ever be. Lord Wellesley insisted they were studying, that their minds needed to be cultivated in silence, free from the distractions of children's games or the taint of society's influences. His voice was the only one they heard, day in and day out. Eleanor, though she appeared to support her husband's choices, kept her distance from the children as though she too understood that something unspoken lay between them. The children were always calm, always composed, too much so for their ages. Thomas, the eldest, rarely looked anyone in the eye. His gaze, when it was not focused on his lessons, drifted to some faraway place as though trapped in a world he could not escape. Eliza, though more outwardly attentive, had an unnerving stillness about her. Her long dark hair, always neatly combed, never moved out of place, as though she too had been conditioned to remain perfectly still. And little Mary, always the quietest, always the most withdrawn, would sometimes disappear into corners of the house, only to be found hours later sitting motionless in a shadowy room, staring at nothing. At night, the sounds of the house were strange. There were no cries for bedtime stories, no requests for a drink of water, no scurrying feet down the hallway. The house was too silent, and the absence of sound felt more oppressive than the heavy footfalls of night. The Wellesleys' life was insulated, distant from the rest of the world, and for a time that silence settled over the estate like a blanket. But not for long. Slowly, as the days passed, something began to shift. It was small at first, an offhand comment from the housekeeper, a flicker of hesitation in a servant's eye when asked about the children's whereabouts. They would say the children were busy or deep into their studies, but the unease began to fester in ways they could not explain. There were whispers, of course. Townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, though never within earshot of the Wellesleys, of strange happenings in the manor. Some claimed to hear faint, muffled sounds from the estate's deepest rooms, sounds that were not the kind of noises made by children at play. Others swore they had seen Lord Wellesley alone in the garden at night, staring at the full moon, his face unreadable, an expression that did not match the soft fatherly persona he displayed during the day. The truth was, the Wellesley family was becoming something else, something darker. They had not come to the estate simply to live in isolation. They had come for something much deeper, something that was hidden even from the rest of the world. They had come to nurture an ideology, a philosophy that required silence, that demanded submission to their will. But that silence, that perfect picture of family life, could only last for so long before the cracks began to show. And when they did, there would be no turning back. Lord Wellesley's vision for his children's education was not one of simple learning, but of total domination over their minds. He crafted a curriculum that had no place for the usual comforts of childhood, a program that twisted the very idea of knowledge into something much darker. Children rose at dawn, not to the sounds of birds or soft conversation, but to the stern tolling of a bell that echoed through the manor's long hallways. It was a cold, mechanical sound that seemed to pierce through the soul, a reminder that there would be no room for warmth, no room for softness in the Wellesley household. The children sat at wooden desks that were more like cruel instruments of restraint than places for learning. Lord Wellesley was their sole instructor, their sole source of knowledge, and he had chosen subjects that no child should ever be exposed to. The first lessons were in ancient texts, the kind that spoke of alchemy, astrology, and the dark arts, subjects that to the outside world were mere myths or superstitions. But to Lord Wellesley, these were the keys to understanding human nature, to bending the human will. The children were made to memorize these passages, to repeat them until the words lost all meaning and became mere sounds in their mouths. Each word was an incantation, each sentence a chain around their minds. They were taught the ways of manipulating the soul, of unlocking the deepest recesses of the human mind through control and fear. The subjects grew darker with each passing day. The children were introduced to unsanctioned medical practices, mutilations disguised as treatments, the breaking of the body as a path to understanding the mind. Lord Wellesley's lessons spoke of revelation through pain, and though the children did not yet understand what it meant, They were forced to memorize it. Their minds were molded with every passing hour, the words sinking deep into their consciousness. The images these words evoked would never leave them. These lessons weren't about knowledge, they were about power. Power over the mind, over the body, over their very will. And as each lesson grew more perverse, the children became quieter, more withdrawn. They began to obey without question, their eyes growing distant, as if the lessons were no longer reaching them. They had already entered a place far darker than their father's control. The curriculum was not simply an academic regimen, it was psychological conditioning. Lord Wellesley spoke of it often in his calm, almost soothing voice, explaining that their minds must be kept pure, untouched by the taint of the outside world. But purity to him meant obedience. It meant silence. It meant the complete eradication of their individuality. The children were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, and even then their responses were to be measured and restrained. Their emotions, their needs, none of these were acknowledged. It was as if they were no longer children, no longer human. They were vessels for Lord Wellesley's control. And yet, for all his control, he never spoke of one essential thing, where the children slept. There were no discussions of bedtime, no mention of the need for rest, for comfort, for any of the things that children crave. The manor's servants occasionally wondered but dared not ask. They noticed the children's faces, pale, sunken, their eyes always just a little too wide, a little too sharp. They never seemed to sleep like other children did, and yet they never seemed tired. It was as though they had learned to exist without the need for the basic comforts of life. As the days wore on, the children's behavior grew more unsettling. They began to whisper among themselves in voices so low that even Lord Wellesley, ever the watchful eye, could not hear them. The whispers were not of the outside world. They were of something darker, something only they seemed to understand. Their once pristine clothing became worn and tattered, but Lord Wellesley took no notice. He believed that such things were distractions from their true purpose. The children were not to be distracted by the trivialities of normal life. They were to become perfect extensions of his will, and in that, they would find their place in the world. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic in the way Lord Wellesley structured the days. Each task, each lesson, each moment of silence was a building block in the construction of their minds. The children learned not through play or exploration, but through suppression, through control. They were conditioned to believe that every action, every breath was in service to Lord Wellesley's design. And as the children continued to recite the dark texts and memorize the grotesque practices he forced upon them, their sense of self began to fade. The whispers grew louder, but only to each other, never aloud, never to their father. They no longer thought of themselves as children, but as instruments of their father's will. They were not meant to grow, to live, to feel. They were meant to serve. And yet, in the quiet, when Lord Wellesley was absent, the children would gather in the corners of their rooms, speaking in hushed tones. They spoke of things they could not name, of things that were not allowed to be spoken. But in the stillness of their silence, they shared the only rebellion they had left. It was not a rebellion of action, for they had been trained to obey. It was a rebellion of thought, the only escape they had, the only place they could still be free. As the days blended into nights and the children's minds became further twisted by their father's curriculum, one thing became increasingly clear. Their education was not a path to knowledge, but to something far more sinister. Their minds had been shaped, not to understand the world, but to break them into something far darker, something that could not be undone. Lord Wellesley's curriculum was not meant to teach them, it was meant to control them. And with each passing day, the control grew stronger, the silence deeper. For years, Margaret had worked for the Wellesley family, a quiet, diligent servant who had learned to keep her head down and mind her own business. The Earl's estate, massive and imposing, had always been an isolated place, far removed from the village, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to smother any outside noise. She had grown accustomed to the strange rhythms of life within the manor, to the silence that often lingered for days, only broken by the occasional rustle of servants' footsteps or the distant hum of Lord Wellesley's stern commands. But recently something had begun to unsettle her. It was the children. At first, Margaret thought it was just her imagination. After all, children could be strange, especially ones raised under Lord Wellesley's peculiar rules. They had always been quiet, withdrawn even, but lately they seemed to drift farther away from the world around them, as if they no longer existed within it. The way they moved, the way they looked at her, blank, hollow, as if they were not quite present, as if their minds were far, far away. She had seen the children in the hallways late at night, moving like shadows, their faces pale under the dim gaslights. At first she thought they were just sleepwalking, but there was something off about it. They never spoke. They never seemed tired. They moved with a purpose, but it was a purpose that couldn't be understood, a purpose that felt like it belonged to someone else. Margaret had tried to ignore it, to tell herself that it was none of her business. But the whispers, strange, faint whispers, had begun to leak from the children's rooms, words she couldn't make out. She had tried to dismiss them, thinking they were nothing more than the wind or the house settling. But the whispers persisted, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. One evening, after another restless night of hearing those whispers, Margaret could no longer stand it. She had to know what was happening. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, she followed the children that night, her heart pounding in her chest. She had told herself it was just a simple check, a way to ease her mind. But as she trailed behind them through the dark corridors, a sense of dread crawled up her spine. They didn't notice her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. They simply moved in unison like automatons, gliding down the hallway toward a part of the house Margaret had never ventured into. The passage was narrow and musty, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The children stopped in front of a door that Margaret had never seen before. It was hidden behind a tapestry, a piece of fabric that blended so seamlessly with the wall that it had gone unnoticed by everyone who passed by. As they stood there, silent and still, Margaret watched in horror as the door opened with a soft creak. She froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The children slipped inside, their eyes not meeting hers, as if they were not even aware she was there. For a moment Margaret stood motionless, unsure whether to retreat or press forward. But something, the same fear that had been building inside her for weeks, pushed her to move closer. Slowly, cautiously, she crept to the door and peeked inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room beyond was small, stark, and unmarked. It was unlike any other room in the house, bare, without furniture except for chains bolted to the walls. The faint smell of something unnatural, something sour, filled the air. It was the smell of decay, of something alive but twisted. The children were gone, but the room still held their presence, a disturbing imprint of their existence. Margaret stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, as if the room itself was alive, watching her every move. The chains glistened in the dim light, and as she stepped closer to the far wall, she noticed faint marks on the stone, scratches, too deliberate to be anything other than human. It was clear now this was no ordinary room. This was where the children were kept at night. The door had been hidden for a reason. The room had been sealed away from the world, and now Margaret understood why. It wasn't just a space for isolation. It was a place of control, a place where the children were kept restrained, their movements limited, their minds confined. It was a prison, disguised as a sanctuary. Margaret's thoughts raced, her breath quickening as she turned to leave. She had seen enough, more than enough. But as her foot pressed against the threshold, something stopped her. The door creaked again, slowly, quietly, as though it were closing on its own. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she spun around, half expecting to see one of the children standing there, watching her with their empty eyes. But the room was empty. She backed away, her feet moving on their own, instinct driving her to escape. As she turned the corner, she collided with a figure, Lord Wellesley. He stood in the darkness, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold as ever. For a moment the world seemed to stop, the air thick with unspoken tension. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, to tell him what she had seen, but the words died on her tongue. Something in his gaze silenced her, a calm, implacable authority that told her this was not a conversation she was meant to have. Lord Wellesley stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "The children are in their lessons," he said, his voice low and firm, but there was something in it, a finality, a warning. He turned away, walking back into the shadows without another word. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her body trembling. But when she looked back toward the room, the door was already closed, the tapestry back in place. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But Margaret knew. She knew that the silence, the calm, the hidden rooms, they were not just a part of the Wellesleys' strange way of life. They were something far more dangerous. Something she was now part of, whether she wanted to be or not. The walls of the manor seemed to close in around her, and as she returned to her duties, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had entered something much darker than she could ever escape. Lord Wellesley's education was never about learning in the traditional sense. It was about breaking the children down, piece by piece, until nothing remained but obedience. Obedience to him, to his rules, to his will. The textbooks they were forced to memorize weren't filled with simple lessons in arithmetic or grammar. No, they were filled with ideas that twisted and coiled like dark vines in the children's minds, ideas that planted fear and dread in the deepest corners of their thoughts. Lord Wellesley's curriculum was a calculated assault on the mind, one that twisted logic and shattered their sense of reality. The children's daily routines were not governed by a clock, but by the oppressive silence that loomed over them, broken only by the harsh commands of their father. There was no comfort in their world, no reprieve. Sleep was a luxury they could not afford. The first step in Lord Wellesley's method was to rob them of their rest. They were kept awake for days at a time, forced to sit at their desks, their eyes wide and unblinking as they recited passages from forbidden texts. They were told that sleep was a weakness, that the mind could only be truly liberated when it was free from the trappings of slumber. The children would nod, their faces pale, their eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. They would say nothing, for silence had become their only shield. Lord Wellesley would stand in the doorway, watching them with cold eyes, his hands clasped behind his back like a predator watching prey. He didn't need to speak to them. His presence was enough to keep them in line. If they faltered, if they showed signs of exhaustion, he would simply call for the cold water and pour it over their heads, forcing them to stay awake longer still until their minds began to fracture. The children never spoke of it. They never cried out, never asked for mercy. They had been conditioned not to. If they made a sound, if they showed emotion, it would be met with punishment. Lord Wellesley had taught them that their suffering was necessary, that it was the only way to purge the weakness from their souls. When the children did sleep, it was not in the comfort of their own rooms tucked beneath blankets. No, they were kept in isolation, their rooms dark and suffocating, the windows covered by thick black curtains to block out any hint of natural light. It was in these rooms where their deepest fears were stirred, where the nightmares took shape. Lord Wellesley had studied their minds, knew their weaknesses, and used them to fuel his cruelty. The children would hear whispers in the darkness, whispers that crawled into their ears like insects, planting seeds of doubt and fear. They were told that the voices were merely their own fears manifesting, that the only way to conquer them was to remain silent and strong. But silence for them had become a prison. It was their only way of surviving, of escaping the mental torture that never ceased. They would not scream. They could not. To do so would be to admit defeat, to show weakness. Instead, they lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, imagining horrors beyond their comprehension. The nights stretched on endlessly, each one darker than the last. The hours felt like days, and the days bled into each other in a haze of exhaustion. And through it all, Lord Wellesley was there, a constant presence, a shadow that loomed over them, reminding them that their suffering had a purpose. The children could feel the weight of his gaze even when he was not present, like the pressure of a hand around their throats, tightening, slowly choking the life out of them. The horrors they endured were not just physical. They were psychological, far more damaging than any wound to the body. Lord Wellesley had mastered the art of manipulation, of bending minds until they snapped under the strain. He taught the children that fear was not something to be escaped, but something to be embraced. He told them that true power came from embracing their deepest terrors, that only by confronting their worst nightmares could they become strong. But what he didn't tell them was that their fears were his creation. The children's nightmares were not born from their own minds, but from the twisted things he had planted there. He shaped their darkness, and in doing so, he controlled them. They were never truly free. In the quiet moments when Lord Wellesley would leave them to their lessons, the children would look at one another, their eyes hollow with understanding. They had become creatures of silence, bound by their torment, locked away in their own minds. They no longer spoke to each other for fear that even the smallest sound would bring them back into the fold of his control. They had become the living embodiment of Lord Wellesley's design, empty shells, filled only with the knowledge of their own misery. The house itself seemed to reflect the horrors within. The walls, once grand and majestic, now felt oppressive, suffocating, as if they too were closing in on the children. The once beautiful estate was now a prison, a place where the children's minds were shackled by the invisible chains Lord Wellesley had forged. The servants, too, began to notice the changes, though they dared not speak of them. They saw the children's faces, their hollow eyes, the way they moved through the house like ghosts, always silent, always careful not to draw attention to themselves. It was as if the children no longer existed in the same world as everyone else, as if they had been stripped of their humanity and turned into something else. And yet, through it all, Lord Wellesley maintained his calm, his perfect exterior. To the outside world, he was the model of a dignified father, a man who had raised his children with the utmost care. But beneath that facade, behind the pristine walls of his estate, the true horrors of his methods festered. The children's suffering was not just a byproduct of his education. It was his purpose. It was the essence of his power, and he would stop at nothing to break them, to make them his perfect creations, no matter the cost. Dr. Samuel Ashford was no stranger to controversy. A renowned physician, his name was both celebrated and whispered about in hushed tones. His methods, though groundbreaking, often pushed the boundaries of ethical science. But when Lord Wellesley reached out to him with an offer of a sizable sum for his services, Ashford saw it as an opportunity to further his research in ways that were previously unthinkable. The Wellesleys had their own brand of mystery, and the case of the children's sleep disturbances intrigued Ashford enough to overlook the growing doubts that gnawed at his conscience. He arrived at the Wellesley estate under the guise of a respected expert, eager to begin his work. Lord Wellesley welcomed him warmly, his polished demeanor belying the darkness that hung over the estate. The children, he said, were his pride and joy, gifted, exceptional, and in need of a special kind of care. They had not been able to sleep for months, a condition that doctors could not explain. Wellesley spoke with such fervor, his voice smooth and persuasive, that Ashford believed he was in the presence of someone who only wished the best for his family. But the longer Ashford stayed, the more he realized that the situation was far from ordinary. The children, he noticed at once, were unnervingly quiet, too quiet. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, with an unsettling vacancy to them. They did not show signs of distress, but rather an eerie compliance, as though they were not fully aware of the world around them. They seemed almost mechanical in their actions, their movements deliberate, devoid of spontaneity or curiosity. Ashford began his observations with the usual medical rigor, charting their sleep patterns, conducting tests, and administering various substances to track their reactions. But soon, he began to suspect something far darker than sleep deprivation. The children were being kept awake for days on end, their bodies deprived of rest, their minds kept in a state of constant agitation. Ashford's inquiries into their treatment revealed something even more disturbing. Their lack of sleep was not an accident. It was intentional. Lord Wellesley had specifically designed the children's treatment, and Ashford quickly understood the terrifying logic behind it. The children's bodies were not just being starved of sleep, they were being subjected to a series of chemical treatments meant to alter their biology, to break down their resistance and make them more malleable, more obedient. The treatments were experimental, drawing from both forbidden medical practices and obscure esoteric knowledge. Wellesley had instructed Ashford to administer certain concoctions, strange mixtures of herbs, minerals, and chemicals that were said to enhance the mind and weaken the will. Ashford, initially hesitant, soon realized the full scope of what Wellesley was attempting to accomplish. This was not medical care. This was a grotesque experiment, a dark manipulation of the human mind and body designed to break the children's spirits and mold them into perfect instruments of control. Ashford, still thinking he could salvage something scientific from the situation, began to probe deeper. The children's symptoms grew worse. They developed tremors, their speech slowed, their movements became more erratic. They no longer recognized their own reflection, staring blankly into mirrors, unable to make sense of who they were. When Ashford questioned Lord Wellesley about the results, he was met with calm assurances. "They are only learning to push their limits," Wellesley said with a practiced smile. "Great minds must endure great trials. This is their path." Ashford could not ignore the horror of it. The children's suffering was no accident. It was engineered, calculated, and necessary to Lord Wellesley's vision. They were not part of an experiment to study sleep disturbances. They were the experiment. Their minds were being altered, their very will eroded until they no longer had the ability to question or resist. Ashford's professional curiosity soon turned to disgust. He began to see the estate not as a place of scientific inquiry, but as a dark prison, one that smothered the light of the children's minds, forcing them to exist in a perpetual state of controlled agony. As the days passed, Ashford's guilt began to swell. The children's reactions were not the result of science. They were the result of cruelty. They were being broken, hollowed out. It was not sleep deprivation alone that caused their downfall, but the combination of chemical manipulation, sensory isolation, and psychological torment. The treatments he administered were not intended to heal or cure. They were intended to force compliance, to shape the children's minds into obedient tools. One night, Ashford caught a glimpse of the children in the courtyard, standing motionless in the cold, their eyes staring at nothing. They did not flinch as the wind whipped through their hair, did not blink as the darkness swallowed the estate whole. They were like statues, unseeing, unfeeling, caught in a cycle of torment and despair. It was at that moment that Ashford realized the true nature of Lord Wellesley's intentions. This was not an isolated incident, not a family with eccentric beliefs. It was a systematic approach to creating a perfect, obedient subject. The children were the first, but they would not be the last. Wellesley's methods were designed to be repeated, to be passed down. This was no medical experiment. This was a terrifying blueprint for control, one that relied on breaking the mind and bending it to a will far darker than Ashford could have ever imagined. Ashford knew he could no longer be a part of it. He had to leave, to expose the horrors he had witnessed. But as he prepared to confront Lord Wellesley, a deep sense of foreboding washed over him. He had become entangled in something far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. The estate's true purpose was not to heal. It was to create monsters, and the monsters were not just the children. They were Wellesley and his vision. And Ashford was no longer sure if he could escape the consequences of the choices he had made. Dr. Samuel Ashford was no stranger to controversy. A renowned physician, his name was both celebrated and whispered about in hushed tones. His methods, though groundbreaking, often pushed the boundaries of ethical science. But when Lord Wellesley reached out to him with an offer of a sizable sum for his services, Ashford saw it as an opportunity to further his research in ways that were previously unthinkable. The Wellesleys had their own brand of mystery, and the case of the children's sleep disturbances intrigued Ashford enough to overlook the growing doubts that gnawed at his conscience. He arrived at the Wellesley estate under the guise of a respected expert, eager to begin his work. Lord Wellesley welcomed him warmly, his polished demeanor belying the darkness that hung over the estate. The children, he said, were his pride and joy, gifted, exceptional, and in need of a special kind of care. They had not been able to sleep for months, a condition that doctors could not explain. Wellesley spoke with such fervor, his voice smooth and persuasive, that Ashford believed he was in the presence of someone who only wished the best for his family. But the longer Ashford stayed, the more he realized that the situation was far from ordinary. The children, he noticed at once, were unnervingly quiet, too quiet. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, with an unsettling vacancy to them. They did not show signs of distress, but rather an eerie compliance, as though they were not fully aware of the world around them. They seemed almost mechanical in their actions, their movements deliberate, devoid of spontaneity or curiosity. Ashford began his observations with the usual medical rigor, charting their sleep patterns, conducting tests, and administering various substances to track their reactions. But soon he began to suspect something far darker than sleep deprivation. The children were being kept awake for days on end, their bodies deprived of rest, their minds kept in a state of constant agitation. Ashford's inquiries into their treatment revealed something even more disturbing. Their lack of sleep was not an accident. It was intentional. Lord Wellesley had specifically designed the children's treatment, and Ashford quickly understood the terrifying logic behind it. The children's bodies were not just being starved of sleep, they were being subjected to a series of chemical treatments meant to alter their biology, to break down their resistance and make them more malleable, more obedient. The treatments were experimental, drawing from both forbidden medical practices and obscure esoteric knowledge. Wellesley had instructed Ashford to administer certain concoctions, strange mixtures of herbs, minerals, and chemicals that were said to enhance the mind and weaken the will. Ashford, initially hesitant, soon realized the full scope of what Wellesley was attempting to accomplish. This was not medical care. This was a grotesque experiment, a dark manipulation of the human mind and body, designed to break the children's spirits and mold them into perfect instruments of control. Ashford, still thinking he could salvage something scientific from the situation, began to probe deeper. The children's symptoms grew worse. They developed tremors, their speech slowed, their movements became more erratic. They no longer recognized their own reflection, staring blankly into mirrors, unable to make sense of who they were. When Ashford questioned Lord Wellesley about the results, he was met with calm assurances. "They are only learning to push their limits," Wellesley said with a practiced smile. "Great minds must endure great trials. This is their path." Ashford could not ignore the horror of it. The children's suffering was no accident. It was engineered, calculated, and necessary to Lord Wellesley's vision. They were not part of an experiment to study sleep disturbances. They were the experiment. Their minds were being altered, their very will eroded, until they no longer had the ability to question or resist. Ashford's professional curiosity soon turned to disgust. He began to see the estate not as a place of scientific inquiry, but as a dark prison. One that smothered the light of the children's minds, forcing them to exist in a perpetual state of controlled agony. As the days passed, Ashford's guilt began to swell. The children's reactions were not the result of science. They were the result of cruelty. They were being broken, hollowed out. It was not sleep deprivation alone that caused their downfall, but the combination of chemical manipulation, sensory isolation, and psychological torment. The treatments he administered were not intended to heal or cure. They were intended to force compliance, to shape the children's minds into obedient tools. One night, Ashford caught a glimpse of the children in the courtyard, standing motionless in the cold, their eyes staring at nothing. They did not flinch as the wind whipped through their hair, did not blink as the darkness swallowed the estate whole. They were like statues, unseeing, unfeeling, caught in a cycle of torment and despair. It was at that moment that Ashford realized the true nature of Lord Wellesley's intentions. This was not an isolated incident, not a family with eccentric beliefs. It was a systematic approach to creating a perfect, obedient subject. The children were the first, but they would not be the last. Wellesley's methods were designed to be repeated, to be passed down. This was no medical experiment. This was a terrifying blueprint for control, one that relied on breaking the mind and bending it to a will far darker than Ashford could have ever imagined. Ashford knew he could no longer be a part of it. He had to leave, to expose the horrors he had witnessed. But as he prepared to confront Lord Wellesley, a deep sense of foreboding washed over him. He had become entangled in something far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. The estate's true purpose was not to heal, it was to create monsters, and the monsters were not just the children. They were Wellesley and his vision, and Ashford was no longer sure if he could escape the consequences of the choices he had made. The Wellesley estate had long been a place of mystery, but now the full scope of its darkness began to unfurl. Lord Richard Wellesley's obsession with controlling the minds of his children, once disguised under the mask of education, now revealed itself for what it truly was, a ritualistic process. An unholy series of psychological experiments designed to break the children's spirits and bend them into obedient tools for his own vision. The children, once so silent and compliant, had already become the subjects of his twisted doctrine. They were not just learning. They were being conditioned, reshaped, their minds reshaped like clay under a craftsman's hands. Lord Wellesley had long since abandoned the notion of education as we know it. His approach was far more sinister. The children's rooms, once innocuous and unremarkable, were now revealed to be the very sanctuaries of torment. Behind closed doors, hidden from the world, Lord Wellesley had transformed these rooms into places of psychological conditioning, places where the true nature of the children was slowly, painfully revealed. It began with sleep deprivation. The children's bodies, so frail from the constant strain, could no longer even recognize the feeling of rest. They would lie in their darkened rooms, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next command, the next ritual. Their minds, deprived of the simple comfort of sleep, became malleable. Their fears, already so deeply ingrained, began to surface in waves, each night bringing with it new horrors. But Lord Wellesley didn't stop there. He had learned the cruel art of sensory isolation, a technique that stripped the mind of all external stimuli, forcing it to focus inward until the mind itself became a labyrinth of terror. The children were kept in these rooms, their senses cut off from the world. The walls were lined with thick fabric to muffle all sounds, their vision obscured by blindfolds. Food was given only in sparse, insufficient amounts. The sensation of touch was removed, leaving them to feel only their own bodies, their own pulse, their own thoughts. And yet, despite the isolation, the children did not scream, they did not beg for release. They had learned long ago that such things would only bring more punishment. Lord Wellesley's voice, when it came, was calm, cold, and methodical. He would enter the room, his shadow stretching long on the floor, and demand that the children confess their sins. The words were always the same. Reveal the darkness inside you. The children had no choice but to comply, their voices trembling as they spoke of fears they had never voiced before, of things they didn't understand, of things that were not even real. These confessions, forced and manipulated, became a part of the ritual, each one a step deeper into the abyss. Lord Wellesley believed that by making the children confront their fears, they would come to know their true nature. What he meant by this, of course, was that he wanted to strip them of all their humanity, to turn them into tools of his will, beings without fear, without doubt, without any form of self. The confessions were just another method of control, another way of reducing them to nothing more than puppets for his design. The children, unable to differentiate between reality and nightmare, began to lose their grip on themselves. Their minds fractured under the weight of the rituals. One by one, they began to lose their ability to speak coherently. Words became jumbled, sentences broken and nonsensical. It was as if they had forgotten how to communicate with the world around them. They had become ghosts in their own minds, their voices empty echoes of what they once were. Lord Wellesley watched it all, his face impassive, his eyes cold. He believed this process was necessary, that this was the only way to unlock the true potential of the human mind. In his twisted vision, the children's suffering was not something to be mourned, but something to be celebrated. They were being purified, stripped of the weaknesses that plagued ordinary minds. He was a man consumed by the idea of control, of dominance, of bending others to his will. The methods he employed were not just psychological, they were deeply rooted in his belief that human beings were malleable, that the mind could be broken and remade. His theories were grounded in early forms of hypnotism, a practice that was still in its infancy, and he had been using it to manipulate the children's very thoughts, to implant ideas, to strip away their individuality. The rituals were methodical, designed to slowly erode any sense of self, to teach them that there was only one truth, Lord Wellesley's truth. But it was not just the children who were affected. The servants, too, felt the weight of Lord Wellesley's influence. They could see the children's slow descent into madness, but they were too terrified to speak out, too afraid to confront their employer. The estate had become a house of horrors, a place where silence was the only defense against the madness that Lord Wellesley had created. And yet, despite the growing sense of dread that pervaded the air, the rituals continued. Each day the children were subjected to more tests, more psychological games, until they were no longer children at all, but husks, empty vessels with no will of their own. Lord Wellesley's vision, so carefully constructed, was unfolding exactly as he had planned. The children were no longer individuals, they were tools, extensions of his will, living embodiments of his control. And as the estate grew darker, as the children's minds deteriorated further, it became clear that this was no longer an experiment. It was a ritual, a dark, twisted ritual that had no end, no mercy, and no escape. The house had become a prison for their souls, and Lord Wellesley was both the warden and the executioner. The air in the Wellesley estate had always been thick with tension, but it grew heavier after the day that Thomas Wellesley died. It was a quiet death, an unnatural one, as though life had been slowly drained from his body like a candle burning down to its final flicker. The official cause of death, of course, was listed as an accident. A tragic fall from the tower, a stumble in the night that led him to the cold stones below. It was a neat, palatable explanation, one that satisfied the outside world, the townsfolk who barely ever glimpsed the Wellesleys in their isolated estate. But those who lived within the manor knew the truth. Thomas had not stumbled, had not simply tripped and fallen. His death had been the culmination of a series of experiments, each more grotesque than the last, designed to test the very limits of the human mind and body. Lord Wellesley had been relentless in his pursuit of perfection, and Thomas, the eldest son, had been the final subject of his twisted vision. The details of the experiment were unclear, even to those who had witnessed it, but the aftermath was undeniable. Thomas had been subjected to a final brutal trial, one last test in Lord Wellesley's dark journey to reshape his children into obedient vessels. The child had been kept awake for days, his body deprived of sleep until his mind was nothing more than a fractured shell, barely able to comprehend the reality around him. He had been isolated, cut off from any human contact except the cruel ministrations of his father. His food had been meager, his strength worn down to the point where his body could no longer support him. The death had not been quick, nor had it been painless. Those who knew him saw the signs, the way his eyes had glazed over in the final days, the way he had lost touch with everything that had once made him human. The other children, though terrified beyond measure, knew the truth. They had watched Thomas descend into madness, had seen him lose himself under the weight of their father's cruel experiments. They had felt the cold, silent terror that gripped them as they too were made to endure the same tests. They knew that Thomas's death was not an accident. It was a result of the mind that controlled them, the hand that had shaped their every move. But the children said nothing. They couldn't. They had been conditioned to remain silent, to endure without question, to follow without hesitation. To speak the truth now would be to betray their father's will. And they had long learned that disobedience led to far worse fates. As word of Thomas's death spread through the town, a ripple of unease moved through the small community. The Wellesleys had always been an enigma, their estate an impenetrable fortress of silence. No one knew exactly what went on behind those high walls, and the townsfolk were too afraid to ask. But Thomas's death forced the question to the surface. What had really happened in that manor? The authorities, when they arrived, were met with Lord Wellesley's calm assurances, his practiced mask of grief. He insisted that it was a tragic accident, a fall that could not have been prevented. His explanation was airtight, and his influence in the town was too great to be ignored. The townspeople, already frightened of the Wellesleys and their isolation, were quick to dismiss the whispers of something darker. The investigation was brief, perfunctory at best. There were no signs of foul play, no immediate evidence to suggest anything beyond the official story. Lord Wellesley's power stretched far beyond the walls of his estate, reaching into every corner of the town, from the law enforcement to the local magistrates. No one dared to challenge him. And so, the truth was buried, just like so many other secrets within the walls of the Wellesley estate. The family returned to their life, their routines unchanged, their silence as oppressive as ever. But there was a shift, a crack in the facade. Though the public story remained intact, something had broken inside the manor. The servants spoke of the quiet grief that seemed to hang over the house, the deep sorrow in Lord Wellesley's eyes when he thought no one was watching. His control, once absolute, began to slip in small, subtle ways. The other children, once so silent, began to act out in strange ways. Eliza, the eldest daughter, would stare at the walls for hours, her eyes distant as though seeing something that wasn't there. Mary, the youngest, would sometimes wander the halls, speaking in a voice so low it was barely audible, as though she were communicating with someone no one else could see. They were lost, broken, shattered by what they had witnessed, by what they had been forced to endure. They had seen their brother die in front of them, and now they lived with the knowledge that they too would soon face the same fate. Lord Wellesley, however, continued as he always had, his facade of calm never cracking. He would visit the children's rooms, speaking to them in the same measured tone, reminding them of their purpose, of their place in the world. He would assure them that Thomas's death was a lesson, a necessary part of their education. The other children nodded, their eyes wide and unblinking, but inside they knew. They knew what their father had done, and they knew that they would be next. The sense of doom that had begun to settle over the estate grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the children who felt it. The servants, too, had begun to notice the changes. The once immaculate manor now felt oppressive, like a tomb. The air was thick with an unspoken fear, a dread that never seemed to lift. They whispered to each other late at night, wondering how much longer the Wellesleys could keep their secrets hidden. But it didn't matter. The truth, as always, would remain locked away behind the high walls of the estate, where no one could see it, no one could question it. Lord Wellesley's mind, twisted and methodical, had succeeded in creating the perfect prison for his children. And now, with Thomas's death, it had claimed yet another soul, leaving only silence in its wake. The estate, once a symbol of power and control, had become a place of suffering, of broken minds and shattered spirits. And though the world would never know the truth, those within the walls of the Wellesley estate knew that something much darker than an accident had claimed the life of Thomas Wellesley. Years passed, and the Wellesley estate, once a symbol of power, control, and twisted vision, fell into disrepair. The grand manor, now abandoned, stood as a decaying monument to a dark history that could not be erased, though it was never spoken of aloud. The walls, once adorned with fine tapestries and ornate paintings, were now cracked and peeling. The windows shattered, letting the wind howl through the empty halls. The gardens, once meticulously kept, had grown wild, overtaken by brambles and vines, a fitting reflection of the chaos that had once thrived within. The estate had been left behind, a place no one dared to enter except for those who had to, for the sake of the memories that lingered in the land's soil. The children, now grown, had scattered across the world, their minds shattered, their spirits broken. They no longer spoke of their childhood, for words could never fully capture the horrors they had endured. Eliza, the eldest, had found herself lost in the shadows of her own mind, unable to escape the nightmares that haunted her every waking moment. She wandered from town to town, a ghost of the girl she once was, searching for something she could never find. Thomas, whose death had marked the beginning of their undoing, had left behind a legacy of silence that seemed to cling to them all. Mary, the youngest, never spoke of what had happened to her, but those who saw her in passing noted the vacant expression in her eyes, the same expression she had worn in the darkest hours of the estate. The children were living memories, walking symbols of a tragedy that the world could neither forget nor fully understand. And though they tried to rebuild their lives, the scars of the past remained etched in their minds, as deeply ingrained as the pain they had suffered. The townspeople, once too afraid to even utter the Wellesley name, now whispered about it in the dead of night. They spoke of the eerie silence that had surrounded the family, of the strange happenings that no one could explain, of the children who had grown up like ghosts in their own home. Some claimed to have heard the cries of the children in the dead of night, echoing through the trees, while others swore they had seen the shadow of Lord Wellesley himself walking the grounds, even after his death. The stories grew darker with each retelling, and as the years wore on, the estate became little more than a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in the town's history that was never quite closed. The authorities, though aware of the strange goings-on, had never dared to investigate fully. Lord Wellesley's influence had been too great, his power too entrenched. The children's deaths and the horrors they had lived through were written off as tragedies, accidents that no one could have predicted. The truth, however, was buried beneath layers of silence, a silence that the children themselves had learned to live with. But that silence could not hold forever. As the children grew older, their tortured memories began to surface. Eliza, in particular, was haunted by the years she had spent in the manor. by the twisted experiments and the dark rituals she had been forced to endure. She would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, her mind replaying the horrors of her childhood over and over again. But even as she tried to speak of it, to release the pain, she found herself unable to fully articulate what had happened. The words were there, but they felt like a curse. If she spoke them aloud, the weight of the memories would crush her completely. So instead, she kept them locked inside where they festered, poisoning her thoughts and her soul. Mary, too, was tormented by the past, though her suffering manifested in ways that no one could understand. She wandered the world searching for something she could never name, never find. She would sometimes stand in the middle of a busy street, staring into the distance, as though waiting for something to happen. Something that would finally make the pain go away. But nothing ever did. The other children, too, were marked by their past, their minds fractured by the horrors they had been subjected to. They had been raised in isolation, deprived of the simple joys of childhood, and what had been done to them could never be undone. The horrors of the Wellesley estate had scarred them beyond repair. The townspeople, now more willing to speak of the Wellesleys, began to tell their stories, though most still hesitated, unsure of how much they could reveal. They spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid that speaking too much would somehow awaken the darkness that had once lived within the estate. Some remembered the children's vacant eyes, their odd behavior, the way they had never seemed quite human. Others spoke of strange rituals performed in the dead of night, of whispers heard from the manor's windows, of the sense of dread that had permeated the air. But even as they shared their stories, they could not bring themselves to fully acknowledge the truth. The estate had become a place of myth, a place where the horrors of the past were locked away, never to be fully confronted. And so the Wellesley legacy endured not as a story of tragedy, but as a symbol of the silence that had kept it buried for so long. The estate was eventually turned into a memorial, a place where the children's names were carved into stone, where the town could pay their respects without speaking of what had truly happened. But even in the shadow of the memorial, the silence lingered. No one truly knew what had taken place within those walls, and those who had witnessed the horror were too afraid to speak. The truth, as always, remained hidden, buried beneath layers of denial and fear. The legacy of the Wellesley family, of their dark experiments and their broken children, would never be fully acknowledged. And so, it became a ghost, wandering through the town's history, a dark reminder of a time when silence reigned, and the horrors that could not be spoken were allowed to thrive in the dark corners of the world. The children, now scattered to the winds, would carry their scars with them forever, their memories forever trapped in the silent void. They were the last living symbols of a tragedy that no one dared to face. The Wellesley legacy was not one of fame or glory. It was a legacy of silence, of broken minds, and of horrors too deep to ever be fully understood. And in that silence, the darkness would live on. The Wellesley estate, now abandoned and decaying, still stands as a silent testament to the horrors that transpired within its walls. Its very structure, cracked, crumbling, and haunted by shadows, echoes the dark legacy left behind by Lord Wellesley and his children. Though the official records have long since closed, the truth remains buried beneath layers of silence, a silence that the world never dared to break. The children, once the subjects of their father's twisted vision, are scattered to the winds, but their scars, both physical and psychological, remain etched into the very fabric of their beings. The town, too, has moved on, its people having learned to whisper only behind closed doors, careful not to disturb the peace that has come to replace the fear. The horror of the Wellesley family's experiments, of the manipulation and psychological torment that defined their lives, remains hidden in the dark corners of history. The real evil, however, is not the visible cruelty of one man. It is the silent, insidious nature of that cruelty. How it seeped into every crevice of the estate, into the hearts and minds of those it touched, and how it has survived undetected in the corners of society. Evil does not need to be loud to be powerful. It doesn't need to scream to make a show of its presence. It can thrive in the quiet, hidden places, the places where no one is looking, where no one dares to speak. The Wellesleys were not an isolated case. Their story is not one of a singular madman, but of a system of power that can bend the will of individuals and create suffering in ways that are never fully recognized until it is too late. Lord Wellesley's methods were not unique. They were just hidden beneath a mask of respectability, of normalcy, and that mask is often the most dangerous kind of evil. His power was not derived from force, but from the quiet manipulation of those around him, the systematic dismantling of the human mind, the careful erasure of free will. And so it is with all evil. It operates in silence, wearing the face of good, of reason, of authority. It makes itself comfortable in places where no one dares question it, where no one looks too closely. The Wellesleys were a family that lived behind the mask of wealth and dignity, yet their actions were anything but respectable. They were an embodiment of the darkness that lies just beneath the surface of society, waiting to emerge when no one is paying attention. The scars left by their actions are invisible to the outside world, but impossible to erase for those who lived through it. The children, though they walked away from the estate, carried the weight of their father's cruelty with them for the rest of their lives. Their broken minds and shattered spirits could never be fully healed, and no amount of time could erase the torment they endured. It is easy to dismiss the story of the Wellesleys as a relic of the past, as something that could never happen again. But that is the danger, isn't it? Evil thrives in silence, and silence is often the first step toward complacency. As long as we allow cruelty to be hidden behind closed doors, as long as we turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, we are complicit in allowing it to thrive. The Wellesleys may be gone, their estate decaying, but the legacy of their actions lives on in the systems and structures that still allow cruelty to fester in the shadows. The question we must ask ourselves is simple yet terrifying. Could this happen again? Could we too allow the darkness to creep in unnoticed, allowed to thrive in places where we least expect it? We live in a world where silence often protects the powerful, where the most horrific acts are hidden behind the guise of normalcy and respectability. The Wellesleys' story is a stark reminder that evil does not need to be obvious or loud to be deadly. It is the quiet, insidious cruelty that thrives in the corners of society, in the places where no one dares to look, where the suffering of the powerless is ignored in favor of maintaining the appearance of civility. And so, We must ask ourselves, are we really looking? Are we truly listening? Or are we like the townspeople, too afraid to speak, too comfortable in our own silence? The legacy of the Wellesley children is not one of triumph, but of warning. It serves as a reminder of the lengths to which power can go when it is hidden behind respectability, when cruelty is disguised as care, and when evil is allowed to thrive unchecked. The truth of their suffering, their torment, is buried in the silence that surrounds their story. But the truth remains just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And if we are not careful, if we continue to allow the darkness to hide behind closed doors, the horrors of the past may repeat themselves. The cycle of silence and suffering could start again, and the legacy of the Wellesleys will become a ghost that haunts not just the estate, but our own society in ways we may never fully understand until it is too late.